Welcome to the Victims and Villains podcast, a podcast dedicated to educating and engaging mental health awareness through the lens of pop culture. And this is a special episode for us. We are taking a break from our 350th celebration of the Batman Schumacher films. This is episode 350.1, where we're sitting down with the writer and director behind Possessor, Mr. Brandon-Cronenberg. How are you doing today?
I am good, thank you. How are you?
I'm well. So I think one of the things that I really want to ask getting into this, first off, congratulations on this just beautiful film. It's artistic, just nuts movie. One of 2020's best horror movies.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
So I'm always really interested in the process that it takes a writer or director to going from one project to the next. And a couple years ago, I come across a little movie called Mandy. And Mandy was done by a filmmaker by the name of Panos Cosmatos. I probably mispronounced that name. And his previous film was an 8-year gap. You two coming from Antiviral to Possessor, there's also an 8-year gap. And I'm just kind of curious, what was the creative process like during that 8-year gap? Because it's interesting to have such a large gap in the body work.
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty unpleasant process, to be honest. I mean, early on, it was fine because part of that was that I didn't have a film career when I made Antiviral. It was my first feature film. It took me 8 years to get there to the point where I could make a feature, but then I didn't have anything else because I just didn't have, other films in development. I wasn't a filmmaker before that. So there was a certain amount of time spent just writing and developing stuff, and I had too many ideas, and I kind of had to split up to the script I was writing into 2 scripts, and there was some time spent there. But then, honestly, a lot of it was just the usual indie film issues. I mean, sometimes it's hard to get financing and casting, and the film started prepping and then fell apart. I think we ended up pushing it a couple times a year for like 3 or 4 years, and not for any exciting reason, just again, usual indie financing stuff.
It's interesting to kind of hear the struggles kind of moving from Antiviral into Possessor, because I haven't seen Antiviral yet. It wasn't even on my radar, but after watching Possessor, it definitely is now. And one of the things that you had talked about, because I went through all the special features in this Blu-ray, and I have so many questions about the technicalities that went into making this film. But kind of before we get there, it's really interesting the detail that you bring to Possessor, because you talk about it in the Blu-ray that this is a alternative 2008. And I'm just kind of curious, what was the process like of like what you were going to keep from kind of the era of 2008, and then what you were going to slightly tweak to be a little bit more technologically advanced for the society?
Well, one of the reasons I did that was just to compartmentalize an aspect of the film in my own mind. The technology, the body possession technology could, I think, probably exist. I mean, I did a fair bit of research into the neuroscience behind physically controlling brains and electrical stimulation of areas of the brain and brain implants. Really fascinating, kind of disturbing history there, if you want to delve into it. But the thing is, for that technology to exist, I think it would have to be fairly far into the future. And I was looking to really not make predictive sci-fi, not to try to paint a picture of what things will be like, but rather to use that technology sort of metaphorically to talk about the way we behave, the ways that people build characters and narratives just to operate. So for me, setting it in an alternate recent past was just a mind trick for myself to kind of say, okay, this is a different timeline. This technology just exists because things have evolved differently in this timeline. It frees me up to sort of aesthetically play with the world, but it was mainly to not try to
And
position that technology as the near future, you know?
yeah, it makes the film timeless in a sense too. Another great example that I can point to would be the animation style of Batman the Animated Series, where it feels very much like in the 30s and 40s, but yet it still felt very modern to the 90s when it was coming out. And so just kind of by taking that approach of saying, okay, this is 2008 where we're still going to have flip phones, but we went another way, technologically speaking, you are engaging into a timeless cinema by that point.
Um, certainly glad if it comes off that way. I mean, I, I think the interesting thing with predictive sci-fi right now is when you're talking about near future technology, that's kind of been cornered by Black Mirror in a way. I mean, it's interesting talking to people about the science fiction film industry world right now, because everyone is worried about doing something that just feels like a long Black Mirror episode. Black Mirror really understands that near future thing so well, but it also ends up being its own kind of aesthetic, and it can get kind of boring. I think if you keep doing that, great for what Black Mirror does, but I just wanted to do something that looked different, that felt different, that was sort of more tactile and in some ways analog, I guess.
And let's kind of go into the look and the feel of Possessor, because for people that may have never not seen the film yet or might not know the technical details that go into that, you guys completely, almost with a couple of scenes, like just did away with the CGI in this movie. Almost everything we see is practical effects. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk on that for a few minutes, just kind of what were some of the challenges going into practical effects and really why you wanted to be practical in a digital age.
I mean, I think there are two things that I like about practical effects. One is there's a kind of tactile quality to them when you see them on screen. I mean, I don't have anything against CGI, and I sometimes what I'm saying is sometimes misinterpreted as like an anti-digital stance. It really isn't. But I think when you have something physical to play with, at least if you're starting with like a convincing practical effect and then enhancing it digitally, it has a kind of weight to it on screen. The actors have something to work with. It's just like there's something to it that is satisfying in a particular way. So I like to at least go as practical as possible for that reason. And the other thing is there's a sort of process element involved as well, because, for instance, my cinematographer is Kareem Hussein, and we're quite close friends. He lived down the street from me for a lot of the development process, and I would just go to his place and we would mess around with lenses and projection feedback and gels and anything that we could do to distort the image and create this bank of tricks that we would then bring to the film, which, I mean, we had a long time, obviously, to build that stuff up because development was so long. But one of the things when you're doing that, when you're working in a hands-on way, is that you stumble onto these happy accidents that sort of take you off down another path, and something that you weren't expecting suddenly turns into a key part of the aesthetic. You can only really do that if you're working in a practical way, or at least I can't. I'm not a VFX wizard, so maybe there's an equivalent of that if you're doing your own VFX. But for me, having my hands on the lights and gels and lenses is useful.
And I loved watching the making of some of the practical effects in here. Like, I don't think Possessor would be the same film experience had it been all digital. I came away with such a greater reverence for this film because of all of the practical stuff. And there's two scenes in particular where Andrea and Christopher's characters are merged together and then break away. And that, just kind of seeing the behind the scenes of how that was made, it's like, man, like this feels like when I was growing up, one of my favorite television shows to watch was like Rick Baker's like making of practical effects. And so it was like almost nostalgic for me to get to see that. And then also I loved watching I guess it's like the plastic or like the latex like body parts just like standing in front of the heater. Just how long does something like that, like an effect like that, take?
A very, very long time. It was that stuff was actually wax. It was meticulously
Okay.
painted wax that Dan Martin designed, our effects artist, who another guy full of fantastic ideas, and there was stuff that we could only really do practically because he was so good. Like his fake heads are incredibly convincing, and we could put a probe lens, an inch away from a scalp that he made with hair punching, and that was, we were shooting things that I was surprised we could even shoot, given that they were puppets. But the melting of the head, I mean, the whole, that was the last part of the official shoot, was people in a warehouse slowly melting wax with heat cannons. And it was funny because half of the crew was watching the Toronto Raptors play in the finals, and then the other half of the crew was just obsessively watching this wax melt very, very slowly. So there was like a very clear divide. You could tell what kind of a person everyone was in that moment.
That's awesome. And I think to go back to this film having a very distinct look, the yellows and the reds and the blues are so predominant throughout the course of this film. And again, that's another practical tool that you guys use, just kind of putting a color sheet over the lens. And I'm curious, like, being that this film was in development for so long, did you guys was that always the choice that you guys had, as far as kind of being like very intentional and very intense with like the reds and the yellows and the blues?
Some of it was there in the script. The blue, the sort of the red flashes. There's a scene where it flips back and forth from a red hallucinated world to a kind of real color world. That was something that was written into the script. The blue was something that came through in prep when we were figuring out the lighting for the bedroom scene, and some of the blues, not lighting effects, but it connected to some of the blues that were used for the zoo through building the costumes and the cars and stuff. The yellow was something that actually came very late in the process. I mean, we had played with that kind of yellow flaring, but those yellow scenes, when the image kind of bends, that's rephotographed off a projector with lenses, and I'm standing there flaring the side of the lens with a yellow flashlight. That's how you get a lot of that effect. And it ended up working well and feeling really thematic. So those scenes were always going to be hallucination scenes with some kind of visual breakdown. But again, it was to stick with that one color and to make that thematic is something that came through process again.
And to, like, as a director too, one of the things that I noticed that was talked about in the Blu-ray, and by the way, everyone go check out this Blu-ray right here. I'll have a link in the show notes because it is well worth the price of admission and to add to your physical collection. You had talked about how, like, there are these very intentional shots to where, like, when you can get into like Andrea's like world of kind of like her daydream, that like it's shot a very intentional way, and then once you kind of like are able to kind of see her enter into like the real world again, it's shot another way. And I'm wondering if you can kind of just talk about that process of development for those particular choices.
Sure. I mean, Kareem and I like to have rules when we work. We sort of set a visual rule set at the beginning, and we end up breaking the rules and rethinking it sometimes when necessary. But we like to go into a film really having the kind of visual rules set. So we'll go through and do a kind of theoretical shot list before we have actors, before we have sets, before the crew is all there, just as a way of talking about how to shoot. In this case, I really wanted to have a different look to the scenes when Voss is in her own life compared to when she's in somebody else's body. but I didn't want it to be too obvious. I didn't want it to be like one is black and white, or it had to be kind of subtle. So the rules we made were, when she's in her own life, when she's outside of the machine, it's all handheld, and the focal depth is a little deeper. It's a little harsher. So it has that kind of anxious quality that you would normally expect more for action scenes. But for her, she has this discomfort in her own life. She has this discomfort when she's outside of the machine. So it has an anxious quality that I like. And then when she goes into the machine, when she possesses someone, it's all Steadicam and dolly and tripod. There's no handheld, and it's very shallow focal depth and softer lighting. So it has this kind of more dreamy, traditional cinematic quality to it.
Before we kind of get into a little bit more of the narrative detail questions, one of the things that I'm sure that like every filmmaker hates being asked this, but I feel like this world has so much more like to offer, and it kind of almost feels like I'd compare it to like the world of Blade Runner, where you could feel like there's so much more that you can do. And have you guys ever like entertained other stories in this universe?
Absolutely. I mean, it's certainly something I've thought about. Whether I'll be able to, how that would work, what it would look like. It comes down to, what projects you stumble into. It's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to plan. You do what you can do when you can do it. I think a lot of the time, at least at this stage in my career. But I definitely think there's a lot of world that is suggested in the film that isn't fully explored. It's okay if it's left like that. I kind of like films that leave it to the audience's imagination. But I would, if given the chance, I think I probably would step back into it and kind of go down some of those alleys.
Because the element of adding this company that basically allows a host to possess someone else, almost kind of like in a Hitman styled fashion, is such a fascinating tool to be explored in other mediums, whether that is film or that's like a mini series or a series of shorts or whatever have you. Like there's so much left that I feel like this world has left to say, and that was kind of one of the things that I went away with in this viewing of Possessor. I was like, wow, this is a beautiful film, and there's so much left on the floor that could be explored in future installments.
Oh, well, that's, first of all, very kind of you, and also it's definitely on my mind. Hopefully I'll have a chance to do it.
So we're a pretty unique podcast, and that we pull out themes of mental health and we engage listeners and readers. And one of the things that I wrote about in my review for it is Voss's kind of almost loss of identity, or the search for identity that she kind of embarks on throughout the course of this movie, and being in Christopher's body, and kind of how that ends up really setting off these unexpected chain of events for her character. And I'm just kind of wondering if you can speak on how important something like these deeper thematic elements of like identity, and I would even dare say that like her character kind of like when she's in the real world, it almost feels like withdrawal, and the machine kind of feels like an addiction styled relationship. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk on that in the process of kind of how you reach some of those more thematic elements.
Sure. I mean, I think, well, there are a few things. I mean, there's the more general identity question with Voss, which is sort of less the mental health side of it, and more is meant to stand in, I guess, for everybody's process of creating characters and narratives, again, to function. I think we all sort of perform these characters for each other, but also for ourselves, and that's kind of how we operate. To varying degrees, our reflexes and our perceptions of ourselves might be more or less out of sync with how we are in the world to other people. But I think there's an element of that kind of that's inescapable. For Voss in particular, I'd say an addiction element for sure, but also I was looking at drone pilots who suffer from PTSD from their experiences as drone pilots, which is sort of horrifying and fascinating. But there are drone pilots who are traumatized, despite the fact that they aren't physically engaging in this violence, and despite the fact that they're the ones who are causing the violence. I mean, they're the ones piloting the drones. Some of them come away being completely traumatized just by the weight of what they've done, even though it's across the world. And so there's some really interesting interviews and articles about the mental effects of being a drone pilot and what that can do to somebody being responsible for that kind of violence.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you kind of talked about the aspect of kind of identity and how we kind of go from like day to day, because I feel like it's not always necessarily like the same person that you are around family you're going to be at, your job or with your friends. Like everyone kind of gives off a little bit of themselves to different people, and you can definitely tell that this dependency on the machine that Voss has at her employment has definitely taken a role on her family, to where she's separated from her husband, and even when he does invite her to come back, there is that hesitation that she experiences, because it almost kind of feels like the experiences of others really complete her.
Absolutely. And also there's the question of her relationship with violence, and some of the stuff I don't want to necessarily impose my own interpretation, because I like leaving the film open to a certain degree. Again, I just like that kind of filmmaking, even though I have my own sense of what I wanted for the character. But I think it's also a question of, to what degree was this kind of violence something that was in her that was then nurtured and brought to the surface that's now defining her in a way that she can't live this conventional domestic life, or in what way was that instilled in her, and in what way is she being manipulated, as she manipulates other people, basically.
That's really good. Like that's I guess like you spent so much more time with these characters than I have, so you have 8 years on me to know these characters. That's not fair.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about, when you leave a lot of stuff up for discussion, you end up talking to people who have incredibly fascinating, intelligent interpretations of your work that is completely nothing like you were intending, but is still great, and that to me is exciting when people inject it with their own ideas, and those ideas can be so creative and interesting and so beyond what I was intending.
And I don't know if you had thought about this, but one of the questions that I had at kind of coming out of this movie and really looking at Voss's journey in particular is, how long had she really felt like this, and why was Chris's character kind of the linchpin that really allowed her to pull herself out and to say, this is the life that I want to live, even though I know I will be haunted?
I would never, again, it's not something I want to answer yet. I kind of feel some of the interpretation discussions, it's almost like I would prefer to answer them 2 years from now or something, to leave some room for
That's fair.
for discussion, because it's sort of like, I don't want to preclude the possibility that people will be able to have their own ideas about it and disagree with each other, and maybe disagree with me when they hear what I was intending.
No, it's fair, and I want everyone to kind of see this. One of my writers actually got to see this while I was in its theatrical run, and I was so jealous. And then finally, when we got the offer to review it for the website, I was just like, yes, 100%. This was on my most anticipated list. I didn't watch any trailers for this. I just saw the cover image right here, and I was like, I don't know what this movie's about, but I need to see it.
Well, thank you so much.
And I love that you guys went with that particular image to be kind of your marketing, like, central. And I'm curious, like, did you guys play with any other ideas as far as like movie posters or like even like Blu-ray covers or stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think literally hundreds of ideas. It's
Oh, wow.
usually it's done by the distributors, but they'll have people who work with them on design. So generally, you'll get a huge number of sort of mock-ups and try and narrow it down, find a particular direction that works for the thing. So I can't take responsibility for that cover. It wasn't mine, but I think they did a good job with it.
Yeah, and that particular scene, I don't want to like really spoil anything for those that haven't seen it yet, but the particular scene that the poster comes from summarizes the entire plot so effectively well in that, and that's one of the things that I think makes this film effective, not only from a writing standpoint, a visual standpoint, a thematic standpoint, but also a marketing standpoint. I think that this is kind of the complete package of what a movie should be.
That's hugely kind of you, man. Thank you so much.
No problem. Well, you guys can check out Possessor now, wherever you guys get your digital or physical media from. We'll provide links in the description below. But where can people find you online if they want to follow the ever-increasing adventures of Brandon Cronenberg?
They can't because I'm a total hermit. I have a few social
Fair.
media accounts, but I'm literally never on them. So you can follow them. It will be very boring. I'm sorry, I'm too much of a reclusive weirdo.
It's cool. It's cool, man. You know, it is what it is. But go support and watch Possessor. It is well worth your time. It is a beautifully stunning movie, and it has a lot to say as far as identity and just the way that it's visual mental health, and it's a weird bonkers hour-and-a-half movie that you're not prepared for. So just go check it out, and until next time, we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks, man.